talking to Daan about this quite some time back, and I had looked at some data for Saudi in terms of what they refer to as the global data barometer. But my focus was on Saudi, and then Daan had to do a talk on the data in South Africa. So I think that was the main source of your data. Is that right, Daan? Or were there some more elements to it?
So Aidan and I have worked on updating what we presented. So we've also tried to incorporate information from academic studies and from other data
Okay,
sources.
nice. And I think the one comment we were talking about on WhatsApp, when I think you released a graph of the value of intangible assets in the US in terms of how much it had risen, and you compared that to South Africa, and it actually had gone down, if I remember correctly. So that was quite alarming, and it certainly talks to us as data management professionals. We're not converting a lot of our data into data assets. So I think that's a fantastic. It's a fantastic challenge to all of us in South Africa. I think it's everybody around the world, but this is a specific challenge to how well we are doing and some of the issues that we need to deal with in South Africa. Thanks, Don.
Thank you for that, Howard. Maybe just to add to what you've just said, this is incredibly important because if we don't understand how to value data as an asset, institutions, whether they're in the public sector or private sector, can't really make strategic decisions about how to prioritize data and how to, and in the private sector in particular, how to monetize data. So it is really important to have frameworks for understanding how you can value and data compared to other more traditional types of assets. So in South Africa, the fact that intangible assets have not been growing in terms of stock or in terms of investment to the same extent as in major economies should be a big concern because it means that we are not leveraging technology to the extent that we need to, and it means that we are falling further behind. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be summarizing what we know about the data ecosystem in South Africa. Now, I'm joined by Aidan from the team who helped put together a bunch of the analysis that we've done. And what we're going to be discussing is how South Africa stacks up relative to not just advanced economies, also against our emerging market peers. We're going to be trying to talk about what data gaps exist and what the regulatory issues are that we as a community need to be discussing. A lot of the content that I'll be showing will be focused on the public sector, but this is both a public sector and a private sector challenge. From a private sector perspective, there's a lot of data in the public domain that practitioners need to be able to access and use. And so public domain data is really important directly as a source of information and a source of benchmarking, but also the regulatory environment has a bearing on creating trust in data and in creating an enabling environment for data to be used, accessed, and shared. And so, although a lot of the talk will focus on the public sector element, I'm going to be finishing by talking a little bit more about the opportunities from a private sector perspective as well. Now, Aidan and I represent Codera, and we are very passionate about the democratization of data in South Africa. So a lot of our talk will focus on South Africa specifically, although we'll have some comparisons to BRICS and to other emerging markets as well. You can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. We blog twice a day, every work day. We are trying to demonstrate the value and policy and private sector insights that can be gleaned from particularly public domain data and the power of combining public domain data with proprietary information. This slide pack is also very long, so if you would like, if you'd like to double click on any of the content that we'll be discussing, you can go and look at the extra slides where we actually dig into some of the indicators. And so there's a lot more detail in the extra slides if you'd like, but we can in discussion also go there.
Sorry, Don, could I ask a question before you go?
Of course.
I know Econ Data and Cadera, I mean, Econ Data is your platform. So you building this platform of economic data, have you thought of valuing the data that you have there? How's that going? How are you handling that sort of, what is the value of the platform that you see at the moment?
So just to give you a little bit of detail, so our Econ Data platform brings together data, economic and financial data, as well as a lot of socioeconomic data for South Africa. That's in the public domain, but not easy to use. So for those of you that are used to looking at regulatory data or data from official data providers like Statistics South Africa, a lot of data is provided as snapshots. So from a user perspective, it's very difficult to create time series in order to do historical analysis, research, or if you're interested in automating any workflows that use public domain data, it presents a meaningful challenge. So Econ Data solves that problem for the community. So Econ Data is very much like the St. Louis Fed's Fred data system, or DBnomics, for example, as an example of the freely available platforms globally. What makes Econ Data different is that it's built on an SDMX information model, so it's in line with international best practice for data management. It also means that you can use our API to or our Excel plugin to access public domain data for free if you're if you're a researcher, for example. So our hope is that with Econ Data, it also helps the community by not having to replicate work, by making it possible that data is made available in an easy to use but highly governed and validated way. So, but we can talk about that a little bit more, and I can show anyone that's interested. But please get in touch with me if you'd like a little bit more information. So in terms of your question about ROI, it's something that we do think about, and we tend to focus more on individual projects. So how data, to understand in a specific use case, what the value that can be generated from a specific data source is in combination with models in particular. But it is an interesting question, and it's something that we could think a little bit more about. The existence of the platform means that you can see on our website, there's some videos of how we show how the existence of Econ Data can turn you into a super analyst, can 3x your productivity. So, even for an individual analyst, it can make it much easier for you to run models, to do your job better. But I think for us, in terms of measuring ROI, it's very much about at an institutional level, what are the specific outcomes that need to be achieved. So it's about using that public domain data with proprietary and third-party data and models to generate decision-ready analytics in a specific context. Okay, so with that, let me kick off. Reliable and timely data is incredibly important. In the public sector, it's really crucial that you have correct and timely data for evidence-based decision-making. And in the private sector, business decisions need to be based on information about what is going on at the moment and what might that mean for the future. So trust in data, and the availability of data is absolutely important. Now, if I put my economist hat on, data is also really important as a driver of innovation. And it itself is an important source of value, particularly in the private sector. So I've got a couple of examples here of studies that show that better development outcomes are achievable through evidence-based policy, and that just the adoption of better data standards actually have a meaningful macroeconomic impact on an economy, but through things like improving transparency and accountability. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be talking about South Africa's data ecosystem in 3 dimensions. The first is the availability of data. Second is quality. The third is how we stack up in terms of our regulations compared to other economies. And then I'll finish by talking about the challenges and opportunities that exist to us as data practitioners. I'd like to start by just talking about a set of principles known as the FAIR principles that Howard introduced me to. There's a lot of debate about whether these are the appropriate set of principles and whether they should be expanded to include other concepts. But I think it's a really good starting point for us to think about both from a public policy perspective and then from a data management perspective in individual institutions, to think about what best practice looks like for data. Now, the first is that the first principle is that data should be findable. So data should be discoverable. And in particular, the metadata associated with data needs to be readable by humans and by machines. So that's really important from a user perspective, so that data can be used and understood. Then there's an important accessibility consideration, which is about whether there are, for example, open protocols for the retrieval of the data as well as the associated metadata. Then another important principle is interoperability. So the extent to which data can be integrated with other data, and whether data can be used in an interoperable way so that an analyst can use the data in different software to analyze it, or to process the data, or to store it in different forms. And then lastly, what's important is reusability of data. So are there specific domain definitions of what quality data looks like? How can data be reused in different settings? And how could things like user licenses be set up to make sure that data is used appropriately in different settings? So that's a set of underlying principles to bear in mind before we start looking at judging South Africa's ecosystem compared to best practice. So let's start by focusing on the good news, because there are a bunch of things that actually are quite encouraging about the South African ecosystem. So as Howard suggested, we are going to be looking at a lot of results from the Global Data Barometer survey, which is a very large cross-sectional survey of over 100 different countries that goes into lots of detail about how regulatory frameworks stack up, and how data availability and data capabilities compare across countries. You can see here that we've compared South Africa in red to Brazil in cyan, and then in dark blue to the global average. Excuse me? Sorry.
Hi, Don. Yeah. I'm trying to find the...
No problem. I'll just continue. So South Africa stands out in a couple of dimensions. We compare really favorably internationally for budget transparency, the availability and the detailed nature of budget. So this is national budget and provincial budget data. So public finance statistics, we stand out very well. And we also stand out in terms of the existence of frameworks for the protection of data citizens' rights. So think of POPI and POPIA. We do okay as well on the availability of vital statistics, and we'll dig into that in a bit more detail shortly. Let's dig into public finance data. You can see that South Africa ranks very high by global standards in terms of budget the availability of budget data, the level of detail, the timeliness of that data, and as a result also on the extent to which that supports governance in the public sector. You can look in the extra slides for lots more detail from different surveys that all show the same thing, that South Africa, this is one area where South Africa should be very proud of what we've achieved. And this, again, this is something that we need to build on. So what this chart shows you is an extraction we did of all of the World Bank's data. Now, the World Bank is one of the major suppliers of cross-country socioeconomic data. And so it's a good way for us to benchmark how much data is available in South Africa relative to other countries and what kind of data is available. So this isn't just economic or financial data, it covers a lot of socioeconomic indicators as well. So what we've done on this chart is we've plotted all the countries in the world on a scale that displays how wealthy they are. Because you'd expect countries that are wealthier have more resources with which to create data, but it also helps you understand whether where South Africa ranks in terms of the resources available and in terms of the data that's available. You can see that South Africa actually compares quite well to most countries overall in terms of the number of series that are available, so the number of concepts. But if you compare to how timely that data is, so the average year of the data series that's available, the latest vintage of the data, South Africa lags a little bit further behind. So we've got lots of data, but the data is less up to date. That means that the data that public officials or the private sector have, if they're trying to do cross-country comparisons between how it's going in South Africa and other countries, means that decision makers have less information available, less timely information available with which to make such comparisons and decisions. Now let's look a little bit about where South Africa ranks a little bit lower. Now, South Africa stands out internationally for how poor our scores are on the extent to which there are initiatives both in the public and the private sector to make data more open and more publicly available. And this is not just on the policy side, it's also on capabilities. There's a lot more detail again on this in the extra slides, but you can see that South Africa ranks really far down compared to major advanced and major emerging markets in terms of the existence of open data policies. So what are open data policies? There's been a big move internationally for open by default policies in the public sector. So that data should be made available unless there is specific sensitivity around the data. And that's a really good starting point. But unfortunately in South Africa, there are many public institutions that have a mandate to make their information public that just do not do so. So for those of you that follow us online will know that we publish a lot of blog posts where we collect data from different public institutions. And from our experience, there are many major South African institutions that don't respond to emails, don't load any of their data online, and despite having a public responsibility to be accountable to taxpayers and society more broadly, don't make their data available. So it's a very important issue, and it's something that's that as a community we need to have a conversation about, because without good quality public data, it's really important. It's really difficult both for the public and the private sector to make good decisions, or for us to hold leadership accountable.
So sorry, Daan. So we're seeing here that whilst we've got data sets somewhere, there's no policy. We've defined no policy about any of our open data. So does that mean that we are each, maybe ministry or whatever it is publishing their set of data, but it's not a government effort. Is that what it's saying?
Yes, I'm going to dig into this a little bit more
Okay.
as we go on, but that's an important point that in most countries, there is a coordination mechanism to ensure that there are minimum standards across different dimensions of data management in the public sector in particular, as well as rules for the private sector. So this means things like the existence of a national data catalog of public information, the ability for you as a citizen to query public institutions and for them to have a responsibility to respond. Standards for data catalogs and data management, and rules that govern how the private sector is able to use and share data. So I'm going to dig into that in a little bit more detail shortly. Let's look at some of the areas where South Africa performs particularly poorly. And a lot of this is in terms of the civil services capabilities in terms of data management. You can see here that, so South Africa, these are areas where we have 0 scores. And very worryingly, this is in things like open data policy, data sharing, governance rules around accessibility coverage and data access, rule policies that support the reuse of government data. And I'll give examples at the end. And things that enable real-time analysis of what's going on in the economy. Now, the reason I wanted to show Brazil on this is that many emerging markets with the same level of resources or less actually score much higher than South Africa, which is to say that this is not a resourcing issue. This is that it's a lack of coordination and prioritization in South Africa. And it's something that both from a private sector perspective, from the community's perspective, something we need to begin having a conversation about because we are falling behind emerging market peers, but also in the context of the public sector, it's really important that the premier policy institutions in South Africa begin to focus on this because because this is becoming a major problem. If we distinguish between public intent data and private intent data, you can see that we've actually performed particularly poorly on this survey. This is an academic piece from the World Bank that shows that we actually perform really poorly when it comes to private intent data in particular. So this is not just a public policy question. This is also about the rules of the game for the use of private data. Now let's try and disentangle this and ask what is the actual problem? Where are we falling behind? What I've tried to do on this chart is look at spending levels in different countries to get a sense of the extent to which prioritization of national statistics through the budget is made. So you can see that South Africa's here in the middle. We compare favorably to many larger countries. So it doesn't, off the bat, it doesn't look like this is not that there's a lack of prioritization of data, that there's something else. So let's see what that might be. One of the big things that these surveys demonstrate is that South Africa has very low scores for machine readability. Now that's really important because if you want to automate any analysis, if you want up-to-date information displayed on dashboards, or if you want to actually use the advances in computing power for things like AI or machine learning, we can't actually use sophisticated methods. We can't actually analyze data at scale without being able to leverage computers. And so the fact that the data is provided in non-machine readable format is a serious issue. And that's, even though this survey is slightly out of date, this is still the case. Most of the data by major statistical providers in South Africa is not easily machine readable.
Sorry, Don. That one of the other aspects that hasn't been raised is if it's not machine readable, then it's very hard to curate that data and ensure that it lives on so we can come back and visit it, right? So one of the biggest issues is trying to get back to why they made a decision 5 years ago and what led to it. And if we can't get in and we can't look after that data, then we there's not much we can do.
It also means it's very hard to mature data management in South Africa.
Yeah.
At an institutional level, and as if you can't combine data sets, whether it's maturing the data for one group of one institution and data sets, and then combining that information across data sets becomes very different. So this needs to be something that is prioritized. And we know from what's been communicated publicly that there's very little forward momentum on some of these issues. Let's look at summarizing these sets of issues just in two big categories. So in thinking about data governance for a society, there are two things that need to be balanced. The key issue is, how does the regulatory environment enable data use, particularly for market players, while safeguarding the rights of data subjects? So it's about creating an enabling environment for data use, but still respecting any sensitivity, any data sensitivity, data confidentiality issues. And you can see in South Africa, we score poorly on both issues, but particularly poorly on safeguards. So in spite of having really regulations that are in line with best practice in terms of POPI and papaya, there are aspects of our regulatory environment that really scores very poorly by international standards in terms of safeguards. And then we also score right at the bottom in terms of an enabling environment for data use. Now let's understand that a little bit better. And I want to use a metaphor, a motorbiking metaphor, to dig into this. So if you think of to define what safeguards are and enablers are, in a motorbiking context, you can think of safeguards as the things that protect data subjects. So in this case, in the motorbiking example, it's things like a helmet and boots. The enabling environment so that we can actually play with data, we can explore, and we can build things like ramps and the motorbike itself. So let's just give some tangible examples of what that looks like. So safeguards are things that promote trust and governance. So these are things like, let me give you an example. So in most countries, the information regulator makes templates available to promote standardization of certain processes. So if you go and look at if the information regulators in major economies, they'll have templates for data use agreements between the public and the private sector, or between private sector participants. If you go to the South African regulators website, all you will see is details of POPI and papaya. So it's all about what will happen if you don't abide by data privacy rules. There's none of the detail on what responsibilities of data owners are, and what the rules of the game are in terms of appropriate use of data. So, if we are to if we want to take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution, these are really important. It's not just about having appropriate safeguards, it's also about having an environment that enables data sharing and data use in an appropriate, responsible way. It's useful in that respect to distinguish between public intent and private intent. And here's some examples. So as I mentioned, open APIs, open data rules for public institutions, things like open data portals are really, really important. Having policies that ensure that data can be used in different ways, metadata catalogs, public domain data, appropriate exchange rules. For example, clear regulations around how researchers can request data for research, and what the and how those kinds of requests will be handled are really important. But also just more generally, that freedom of information is not just a right, but that there's a procedural process that ensures that access requests are actually dealt with in a timely and appropriate manner. Speaking of my personal capacity, I have made hundreds of requests to public institutions, state-owned enterprises in South Africa, and the proportion of those requests that are answered is very low. So many institutions, if you email them, either their email address doesn't work, or they just don't respond, or if they do respond, then they hide behind confidentiality, even for data that's not confidential. So that's just in the public domain, for public domain data. So there's a big challenge there. There's also a challenge around the capacity of public sector institutions to actually create statistics from their data and appropriately manage and update those. Then in terms of private intent data, these are things like digital IDs, the ability to easily and appropriately anonymize data, to verify data, and things like portability rights, and things like that enable data to be shared, insights from aggregates of data to be cleaned, but in a responsible way that does not conflict with any privacy or sensitivity concerns.
Sorry,
Okay.
Daan. A question that you haven't mentioned open science. Surely that's a big enabler for open data, because they need a stream of data to really address some of the issues or research on some of the issues and give feedback, right?
I think we have seen a couple of examples of that, and a couple of the universities in South Africa in some domains are exploring these things, but certainly it's not something that I think has found general that there are many general examples of that I can think of in South Africa.
Sorry, what I was trying to say is surely the governance of open data will enable open science.
Yes, it's really important. That is really important. To be able to replicate results across domains in order to be able to identify what the problems are in different domains. Okay, so let's move on to just a couple of the regulatory issues specifically. And you can see that South Africa scores really low in terms of across all sorts of dimensions. So in terms of public, private, personal data, non-personal data. Of course, this is slightly out of date. It's 2021, but this is really worrying because of course, South Africa's been grey listed, and we need to be closer to international best practice in terms of how we manage digital information, how we have appropriate safeguards in place to make sure that consumers are protected, their identities are protected. And there are many examples recently. There have been examples of identity theft in large scale and hacks in large institutions. Of course, we also lag in terms of some areas of data. So we have very limited data on things like cross-border transactions in South Africa compared to best practice. There, in the extra slides, there's a lot of detail where we've summarized what the specific data gaps are and what programs there are by the World Bank and IMF and others to try and fill some of these data gaps. So there is forward momentum in some areas, but these are very important because this creates an environment where fintech companies can thrive, where we can modernize, we can modernize and catch up and be part of the productivity advantages that that automation and fintech in particular offer. So let's talk a little bit about what we need to do. This is a very wordy slide, but I think it is it's a good starting point to summarize what the sets of issues are that we need as a community to be discussing. As I've said, we are very passionate about the democratization of data in South Africa, and we see ourselves as being part of that drive. And there are 5 different aspects that are important if we really want to take the democratization of data seriously. And this is democratization of data both from a public perspective and within an institution, within company. The same principles apply. So the ones that I think really matter are security, governance, literacy, infrastructure, and culture. And they're all individually quite difficult to master, but they're crucially important if we are actually to make data accessible and usable within a certain set of appropriate, within a certain appropriate set of rules. So what are the considerations from a security context? So these are protocols that make sure that that once data has been classified, you know that only the appropriate people are able to access the data, should it be sensitive. If there are any privacy concerns, that data is appropriately anonymized and protected, and that there are ways to have user-level security around access. Governance is also incredibly important, but it needs to be balanced against making sure that data is still usable and discoverable. So for that, it's really important to have appropriate data maturity, so that you can attach metadata to data, so that you can understand what the data concepts mean, who the owners are, and have a classification of where the data is sensitive. So it is about having building processes around the use of data that mean that data is used in an appropriate way, and to the extent that that can be matured, you can also make that lighter touch without it being necessarily a meaningful burden on data users or data stewards. So it's really about having best practice policies in place, but using technology to make that, to reduce the extent to which that's burdensome. I've used the example already that in many jurisdictions, there are very clear rules, for example, on how data can be requested, and the basis on which those requests will be considered, and the timelines and the responsibilities of data owners. And that's something where, as I say, at least in our experience, we feel South Africa really falls short, particularly outside of the main statistical agency. In terms of literacy, really one of the key challenges in the public sector is the extent to which data stewards understand, achieve the right balance between data governance and security and data access, so that they enable data use and have the appropriate skill set to keep up with developments in technology and best practice in data management. And that's, I think, where DAMA really plays an important role as well. So that use of data can use data in different ways, and that institutions can remain flexible in terms of giving access to data in different forms, and that data is governed in a way that makes it really clear what the definitions are, that the lineages of data can be traced, that that data can be understood and used appropriately. Infrastructure is also really important for this, and I think this is one area where technological advancements have made it possible for institutions to leapfrog. But there are many considerations that matter. So, as I mentioned, it's really important from a data user's perspective for someone to be able to discover what data is available, understand data concepts. So things like institutional data dictionaries are really important. Maturing data infrastructure to a point where that can be available. Making data available in different forms so that users can use different software to access it, there've been some big advances that, and there are a couple of really good examples in South Africa of some data portals that have been created. And I think these are the kinds of examples that we need to build on, that demonstrate the value that you can get from data by using modern infrastructure in order to make data available and visualize the data. Then I'd just like to make a couple of points about culture. I think one of the distinguishing features in the leading emerging markets that you see is, particularly in the public sector, a commitment to evidence-based policy, to evaluation of outcomes. So, that creates a desire to be able to track outcomes. So having an executive level commitment to tracking information over time, and then from a bottom-up perspective, having buy-in from different parts of institutions to the sharing of data, to collaboration is crucially important, because one needs to be able to combine data sets, to be able to share data, not just manage data for its own sake, but actually make it available and share within a set of appropriate guidelines. And as I said, I think in particular in South Africa, what's missing is a true commitment to open first, unless there's any reason not to. And unfortunately, at the moment, in practice, that's really there is very little commitment to sharing of data, and I think that's something that I'm going to get into in the next slide. So what should we do? So I think there's actually a lot of opportunities in South Africa. All of this might seem very daunting, but the great thing is that there are other countries that have made substantial gains very quickly by learning from what others have done. Now, I understand that there's some legislative reform in train. For example, the establishment of a cloud policy for government, and things like that. But I think what's really important is that not only do we recognize the rights of data citizens, but we also begin to have mandates for sharing by public institutions, nationally determined data standards, that the information regulator begin making available templates for data sharing, that we celebrate successful use cases so that builds momentum and demonstrates the value of appropriate and careful data sharing. Then I think we've worked, for example, with a couple of universities, and I think universities in particular could play a role of being honest data brokers to help deal with some of these issues. And this is, I think there have been many use cases internationally of universities playing that kind of role. And then I think a big thing that's emphasized in some of the reports that I've seen others produce is that there needs to be a coordinating mechanism created between the major public sector institutions. This is the Reserve Bank, the National Treasury, the Statistical Agency, the Information Regulator. to work together to create a coordinating body that is responsible for the creation of the kinds of templates that I've mentioned for guidelines, both public and private, the provision of things like data agreements, and standardization of protocols across the industry. So that's legal, IT, governance, classification. Those are some examples. I think that from other countries that are very important. So I saw someone ask about spatialization. So that's, sorry about the jargon. What that's about is that there's a big debate about whether statistical agencies should make more detailed surveys available that will enable, for example, regional views of that data to be made available, so that you can see how Cape Town's GDP is different from Durban's GDP, so that we can get a finer grain on what's going on. The tricky thing is that the more you spatialize information, the more potentially it raises privacy concerns, or it could raise concerns around the provision of the data if it enables one to identify providers. So it is a challenge, but I think the irony is that technology is making it easier and easier to solve these challenges. So we can't really realize the promise of big data if we can't combine data, public domain and private domain data. If we can't combine it, we can't really do the kind of work that researchers need to do, or that corporates need to do to understand what's going on and make good business decisions. I think that's probably a good place to stop. That gives us a bit of time for questions.
Yeah, Daan, thanks very much. It's certainly something that becomes very apparent when you read FAIR, that the metadata is becoming as important as the data. So yes, you got to share data, but the amount of metadata to support that sharing and not making the wrong assumptions or conditions or understanding, I think it's critical. And I know you guys have spent lots of time with SDMX on ensuring that. So yeah, thanks very much. I really like some of the challenge, and just from my experiences in Saudi, is even the banks have been forced to share open data. And that's sort of what you were saying then. I really like that. And so many times I'd go and talk to the banks and they would clash with me to say, no, we don't need to do that. It's a case of, yes, I think you're right, you are private, but it can help the country so much if you contribute to that sharing process. And it's a nice point you've raised there.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's open it up to the floor. There's quite a few people here. I think there was certainly a challenge on one of your posts, Don. I think it was related to this, to say, it's not just point at the public sector, but the private sector is not doing too well either. I'd love to get some comments. I know Bridget is quite involved, and Drew. Any comments on what Daan has been sharing, and how can we get involved as a data management community to enable some of this?
I was hoping you wouldn't put me on the spot. But yeah, I think the challenges that Daan raises are very real, and the opportunities are real.
Yeah.
But maybe what we need to do is form a series of little work parties that could look at trying to tackle some of these in a collaborative manner, because I think as individuals, even as individual companies, private companies, to go in and do it, you're not going to get it right. And I think to influence some of the government organizations is going to take a little bit of, what's the word? Smoothing. But through everybody talks about public-private partnerships. Maybe we establish a couple of work groups that look at, for instance, a data sharing hub with
Yeah.
the relevant metadata that is of benefit. And maybe we could look to Daan and stuff for some of these examples, also Stats SA and some of the others that are doing it, but maybe not doing it enough. And then if there are companies or countries like Australia or others that are doing it really well, can we take a lesson from that too?
I agree with everything you've said. In terms of examples, I think there's several. See Aidan's put a post out on the spatial tax data, which I think is just a fantastic initiative. It enables you to look at regional socioeconomic outcomes. It's just fantastic. The key issue is that going to be updated and maintained. So, you know, these kinds of initiatives don't work well unless they are they find broad support, they find long-term funding, and so there's this very big strategic element here that's across government, but also across the community. You know, because if the user perspective is not represented, then then some of these things might not get the appropriate level of prioritization. Some other examples are you can go, speaking of our own things, we've used SANROL data, for example, in the past to create a truckometer, to create a nowcasting tool that enables you to look at where our traffic flows and how does that correlate with activity. So there's ways to use alternative data from state-owned enterprises, from the private sector, to use that to get a real-time understanding of what is going on regionally. I think that's something that has just exploded post-COVID in most emerging markets. It's something that we see very little of in the public sector in South Africa today. So for me, really just replicating what some of the leading emerging markets are doing in this space would be a good starting point. I've listed several examples here that I think are worth having a discussion about. But I think there's a role, as you've suggested, a role for the private sector to collaborate with the private sector, with the public sector.
Yeah, if I can add further, Bowd's aware of my mad hobby, which is paragliding, but what the guys are doing in the community is sourcing data from both Weather SA as well as multitude of local, regional and weather stations, and combining that data to present an accurate forecast of what is likely to happen within a micro environment rather than at the macro level. And that explains one of the advantages you can get by pooling public and private data for a distinct purpose.
Yeah, Aidan, yes.
I find that aggregating data is a good way to anonymize it, but ultimately, when one tries to take aggregated data out of a sensitive data set, it needs to go through managers, and it's easy for a data engineer to have the skills to work on that, but then it gets left up to, right at the last minute, gets left to the manager of an organization who needs to have a good enough understanding of data engineering to actually understand what's in that data that's being exported. So I think the bottleneck is now having more data expertise at the managerial level.
If I may come in here, Aidan, I'll
Yes, Bridget.
Can you hear me? I agree with that comment, and I think what I wanted to say with so I've had experience at one particular institution over a number of years so I'm not speaking for all government institutions, but my experience is that the importance of data management is either not, there's talk about it, but it's not executed, not owned. And a lot of the projects are obviously outsourced to, they go out on tender and then they get external companies to come and do projects on their data. But they don't seem to own it. There doesn't seem to be an impetus to really manage data. It's as simple as that. And I think that may contribute to a lot of our problems, number one. And how to turn that around, of course, is is one of the first steps, because if you can't get an appreciation or just an
awareness.
Yeah, and or just to take it seriously almost. I mean, it's taken seriously, but I just feel that there's not enough ownership. It's about the best word I can come up with. That's been my experience as a real problem. Absolutely, not even a business glossary of sorts in financial organizations. But yeah, right. I mean, I think that's probably more common than what we'd like to think it is.
Yeah.
So it sounds, I mean, you don't want to just criticize. So it would be great to have something going that could, start and get some momentum going.
And Dana, I was wondering about that 4IR strategy from the government. I mean, I hear every now and again that there are conferences in Midrand about it. I mean, I saw it maybe 2 years, maybe more, 3 years ago on the 4IR, because there's always this promise that 4IR is going to provide work opportunities, job employment, and it's going to pump up the economy. But if you don't start here.
So I agree with what you're saying. So I think getting the basics right is fundamentally important. You need to, so I think there's no getting around that we need to mature basic data management across government. Everyone is excited about the prospects of what AI and machine learning might be able to offer, but if we can't monitor, even simple budgetary outcomes for specific institutions, if we can't monitor, if we don't even have data glossaries at institutional level, then you need to have appropriate metadata, you need appropriate classification. The good news is that there are technologies that are making it easier and easier to mature quicker. But if you don't do it using best practice, I think it's a fool's errand, because you're going to have to redo it. So getting that right, there's not just the technology challenge, there's an internal culture challenge, there's the strategic challenge, choosing, I think institutions need to develop in-house capabilities for this. The danger of just having consultants do it is that it's once off, and data needs to be alive. And processes and standards need to be in place and maintained. And I think it is a very difficult institutional challenge when you've got, when there's decisions around whether to centralize data management or have a federated system, and how to achieve business outcomes. So these are not easy strategic outcomes, but it is having across department, across government, and a strategic focus is really going to be important for us to elevate this to the kind of prioritization that it needs.
And budget.
Yeah. Don, one of the things when you're talking about this, I was really impressed in looking at a system developed by the Italian government. It's called iStat, and they have a data catalog, and they adhere to a lot of the standards. And the thing that they put on top of that is, because it's a centralized catalog, that now anybody can come and get the data. Now you're going to have overlaps of people that publish data, and then it's a case of, where do I go to get the data? And they're now providing a real-time data quality assessment of the data as it gets published. So they've got this iStat DQ framework, and as people put the data on the platform, they get real-time responses. You can go to the catalog and say, give me the best, the highest quality in this and this dimension for this area or this concept. So, the people are pushing quite hard on that.
Absolutely, and that's why we're committed to SDMX, because it bakes in not just the data governance, bakes in the validation and the quality assurance. So I think these examples are also really important because it demonstrates what can be done. There are fantastic examples in Mexico and Brazil of similar initiatives. And so really, we don't have to agonize about this. You can just replicate what others are doing. And they've demonstrated that with very little resource, you can actually get these kinds of projects across the line that have a massive impact for society, for the data community.
And Daan, maybe to ask you a personal question, because I remember it's almost been 3-4 years since you started the STMX journey, but I do remember in the beginning, it was taking existing series and it was really about getting the data into STMX and not really the metadata. So I'd love to, I know we spoke about a lot in terms of getting all those definitions and getting everything right. And it seemed to be, with all the series and versions and all those different things, how have you succeeded in increasing the speed at which you add the metadata to your time series?
So I'm going to start and I'll let Aidan add on if I miss anything. But I think our journey, what it demonstrates is that a handful of people with hardly any money can actually achieve an STMX implementation. So it's just about, even though the learning curve is very steep, it's really achievable. So, whether you go the STMX approach or you do something else, you can if you are determined and committed, within a year or two, you'll be able to really modernize the way that you do things. So it's really not a money thing. It's more a commitment and strategy challenge. In terms of your specific question about improving the way that you describe metadata, I think what I would say is that there are no shortcuts. Domain understanding is really important. So that's why collaboration is important, working with people who understand the underlying data so that you capture the metadata correctly. But once you've done it, what our experience has been, there's a lot of work that goes into creating the metadata structures, the data definitions. Once that's in, you can then automate the process, and the data management, the day-to-day data management burden is very light. So you have to be willing to invest. Once you're there, you can create processes to automate and to really make the data manager's life a lot easier. So, Aidan, you can, if you'd like to give an example, you're welcome.
Yeah, setting up a new data set takes a long time, and even creating the metadata both in human readable and machine readable format. But as Daan says, once you have a software that can automate ingestion from the same source in the same format, then it can be done within like 2 minutes. You just run the software, and you can also do like validation if you've already created the software to do that. But as I said initially, like setting everything up can take like months to set up a new data set.
Yeah, that's been an experience. Anybody else? Has anyone got any experiences or commenting on making sure that the data that they have has got all the appropriate metadata? Certainly, my advice would be to go and look at what Daan brought up in terms of FAIR, and STMX is one of those executable environments that allows you to ship the two together, which is fantastic. Any comments from the floor in terms of that, or questions?
I think a question would be, what would be nice to see that, or is there a way where could we go and look, for me to go and look to see what it does?
Well, if you want to look at our way of doing it, go and look at econdata.co.za.
Your website. Okay, perfect. Thanks.
But I'd like to emphasize that, you know, in large part, it's a community. We would like it to be a community-driven thing. So we work with others to try and add more data to it, and to make as much public domain data available as possible.
Great. Are there any further comments? If not, Daan and Aidan, thanks so much for putting this work together. I think we certainly owe it to just our community to spend more time understanding how we can improve this and what we can do to help people. But thanks Daan, thanks Aidan. Really appreciate the work you guys are doing. Fantastic.
Thanks, Howard, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks everybody.